Hello and welcome back to Critical Thinking. And this week in Module 6, we're going to look at three different types of reasoning. There are two very common ones, inductive and deductive, that have been around for a long time. But the one I'd like you to pay attention to is one that we use quite often, but we don't really have a name for it. And that name is abductive. So abductive reasoning is really the kind of reasoning that you will be using in the particular field that you're in. So the two main ones, deductive and inductive, have been around for about 2,500 years. But the one I want to look at more so is a very common kind of reasoning. When I say we don't have a name for it, we do it, but we don't really know what it's called. But it's actually called abductive reasoning. So let's kind of break it down and take a look at each one. Deductive logic leads down from a general sort of statement to a specific individual statement that is considered to be the truth. Now, inductive logic leads in a different way from a specific statement out to a general conclusion. So in the same way that deductive goes from wide to narrow, inductive goes from narrow to wide. Now, when you are using inductive logic, you are creating hypotheses and theories and sort of hunches that I believe right now, with what we have, the equipment that we have, this is the best we can do. And science often functions in this way. Philosophy tends to be deductive, leading down to a single premise. I think, therefore I am, for example, with Descartes. But inductive logic uses typically the senses. And it's a way in which we're able to make statements, qualified statements about reality in the world and what we believe to be true. And until we find better scientific equipment, for example, this is the statement we're going to stay with. But we can always learn and say that it is likely the following, right? Now, the third one, abductive logic, is kind of an interesting one because it has to do with following our hunches. And what we have is a kind of conclusion as a best guess. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a shot in the dark and it literally has no bearing in reality. It's what's called a good guess. That's literally what it is. So let's go back and sort of reframe this argument, starting again with inductive reasoning, going from specific to a general conclusion. We reason inductively, right, when we start with a specific observation, and then we draw a general conclusion. I have seen swans. Every single swan that I've seen is white. Therefore, I believe that all swans are white. So I have a specific idea. Swans are white because I've seen them, and I'm going to make a general statement saying I believe all of them are white. There could be a black swan. I don't know. I haven't seen one, but my hunch tells me that that's likely the case. Now, deductive reasoning starts from something that is very general, and it works its way down to a specific conclusion. So we are reasoning deductively when we start with a general principle. And that principle is based on some kind of verifiable specific observation. And then we draw a very specific conclusion. Detectives often work the same way, right? And the killer is the following. That's a specific conclusion. And the generalization is there has been a murder. Well, in this house, in the library, and we know the person has been murdered, and we have the possible suspects. So we whittle it down to the person that we think is responsible for the murder. So we come to a specific conclusion, given what we have. So that's generally the two types of reasoning. But this new one that, again, I think we do quite often, but we perhaps didn't have a name for it until now. Abductive reasoning is when you start with a problem. It's a particular situation, such as a slide here. Dead guy laying face down. Okay. And then we go from that to a hypothesis. So we can ask ourselves, this person we found on the floor, we can ask ourselves, did they die of a natural death? Was it an accidental death? Was it suicide? Or was it homicide? So we look at the situation, we examine the problem, and then we formulate a hypothesis. So we are reasoning abductively, not because we have either random data or because we have generalizations kind of sort of rattling around and we're thinking about them. No, what is happening is we're still formulating ideas within a specific confines. So we are hypothesizing because we have a problem that needs a solution. or a question that needs to be answered. Or in the case of your work, a fire has occurred and you're arriving after the fact looking for the cause of the fire. So the problem is a house is burned down, a building of some sort, and you have a series of clues that you need to go through. And then from there, formulate a hypothesis that you are then going to try to figure out whether that is, in fact, the correct one. So, as I mentioned, when you go from specific to general, you create fictions or hypotheses that you're going to try to prove. So you're never sort of, blindly sort of arguing and thinking about a whole range of things. That range of possibilities is still very, very narrow, because as you gain wisdom and experience in the field of fire prevention, fire safety, and being a fire chief or fire inspector, any of these kinds of things, that wisdom and experience is going to allow you to enter into a site and begin assessing the clues that maybe other people don't see, but they are clues to you rather quickly. And so you need to be able to formulate a hypothesis fairly quickly. Now, it could be wrong, and that is certainly a possibility. But given the clues, given the problem at hand and the potential clues that you have, you can begin formulating a hypothesis pretty quickly. So when we're reasoning abductively, we're problem solving, we're answer seeking. That's the kind of thinking that we're doing. And we start typically with a hunch. Now that sounds sort of almost reckless, but it isn't. A hunch is based on something that either is based on previous experience, could be based on previous knowledge of similar fires that seem to have occurred in the same neighborhood or same types of buildings. So you're arriving already with a hunch. I think it might be this. So you start looking for clues that would at least match up with that hunch. And therein lies that kind of detective work. So if we support one hypothesis as being better than another, and we find no other data to contradict it, then we can accept that hypothesis as the best available solution to the problem, at least for the time being. And that's important because it is merely a hypothesis. We are not creating, sort of true facts at this early point, because a hypothesis is exactly that. It's almost like a kind of fiction that is a sort of scaffolding that you build around a problem and say, well, I need these ideas to work with as I keep sort of whittling away the clues until I find the one that really matters. So for the moment, this is a solution to, or tentative solution to the problem at hand, which is trying to figure out what happened to this fire. And so what's happening inside our heads as we're doing this? Well, we're thinking critically and we are reasoning abductively. So we state the problem very carefully in our minds. A fire has occurred here. The clues are the following. There seem to be strange burn marks around the furnace, or there could be what looks like perhaps a very powerful explosion. Maybe the way the wall is sort of caved out rather than caved in tells you that explosion was from inside. All these things start to matter, right? All these things start to really bring together a possible hunch and definitely a possible hypothesis. So we're stating the problem very carefully in our minds. Then we start to formulate some tentative ideas, some hypotheses that are going to guide us towards a possible solution. Of course, making it possible that we could be in fact wrong. And this is where abductive thinking is sort of, it lays itself open to biases and prejudices that we may have. And when I say a prejudice, I don't mean something racist. What I mean is something that we are kind of predisposed to look at. We kind of preconceive before we even arrive at that fire site, ideas that we may think are there but are not, or vice versa, that we're not seeing things that are there. So abductive thinking can be very vulnerable to what are called cognitive biases. And that's what I want to look at, are these cognitive biases. Okay, if we can recognize those, then obviously they're no longer biases. We know that in the past we may have favored a particular solution, maybe because it's more expedient. We're able to sort of draw conclusions more efficiently, but there are still cognitive biases. So we need to walk into that scene, right, the fire scene, with as much of an open mind as possible, and somehow balance an open mind with that wisdom and experience that you have gained over the years that you've been doing this. So you have both an open mind, but also the ability to draw very quickly from that pool of past wisdom and experience. So we can use critical thinking to guard against falling for these cognitive biases, because if we do that, we may be looking at something incorrectly, and we don't want to be doing that. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the issues that are surrounding the cognitive biases. The first one is not to rely on warrants in place of evidence. And what that means is we have a potential hypothesis that we want to sort of look for, well, at least looks to claim as correct. And what happens is we're claiming something is true, right? What we think is true, either because we want it to be true or because we already believe it, or possibly even both. So again, we need to keep that open mind, because we may walk in with a preconceived notion, and that in itself is a bias, that this explosion caused the fire, and I talked to a couple of witnesses, and they believe that's what it was. Well, it turns out it was thundering earlier that night, and someone mistook the thunder for an explosion. Ooh, that's going to make it kind of difficult, isn't it? So you want to make sure that open mind allows all possibilities. So you don't want to walk into a potential fire scene, with something in mind that you wish to be true or you already believe to be true, because that is a cognitive bias. So we can fool ourselves in a whole number of ways. We can believe that what we are seeing is actually there when in fact it isn't. We have some kind of firmly held beliefs that this is in fact what's going on. And again, we're not opening ourselves up to other possibilities. And so what happens if we are not aware of this potential, right, to want to believe something simply because we already do believe it? At the best, we may have a partial hypothesis, some partial representation of what really happened, but we're not quite there yet. So if we suspect that our people are holding on to sort of this one true principle, it's something that it takes an awful lot of work to dislodge. A bias, like a prejudice, is a belief in something that you will only look for the things that confirm that bias, instead of, again, keeping that open mind. So that one true principle, and I know we've talked on and off about politics. Let's say the one true principle is, Trump's election was stolen from him, and you will only watch YouTube videos that confirm that evidence. Sure, now you believe absolutely 150% that that's actually what happened. When in fact, let's say videos that deal with that, let's say there's 1,000 videos out there, and maybe 400 of them are in favor of, yes, Trump lost the election through fraud, but the other 600 are saying, no, here's the proof that states clearly that's not the case. But you only watch the ones that confirm what you already know. So there's a bias of the worst kind. You've made up your mind about something, and you refuse to look at anything else other than that which confirms what you already believe. So that is a bias that really you need to knock out as quickly as possible. Now, the second one is when you collect evidence, when you're looking for clues, you're not doing it randomly. Like, you're not simply looking at absolutely everything as equally valid. In other words, equally important. So here's what's going on. Right, we're not thinking abductively or reasonably if we're simply collecting data on the subject, and we literally collect everything that's there. If we are doing that, not only are we going to be wasting our time, but we're going to be going through an awful lot of things that literally yield nothing. So instead, we need to start to formulate a hypothesis. I believe an explosion caused this fire. And then you start to collect data that will confirm this hypothesis. Again, it's not the truth, but it's a damn good idea. Here's what I think happened. So when you're collecting evidence, you're not doing it randomly. You're doing it in order to test the hypothesis. So the more data you collect to prove that hypothesis, the more likely it's correct. But if you keep looking carefully and you are only finding the evidence that will confirm that hypothesis, you also need to be aware that there may be some things that will contradict it. So always leave yourself open to that possibility. There may be one glaring piece of evidence that contradicts everything you think about that is going on. Don't throw that out. Set it aside, right? Set it aside. This is something that doesn't match up. And now many of you are way too young to remember a TV show back in the 1970s called Columbo, starring Peter Falk. Well, Peter Falk would do this kind of thing. Everything seemed to be absolutely cut and dried. Some criminal activities going on, usually a murder, and there'd be some little thing that would just bug this guy to no end. And it didn't matter what it was. Sometimes it was something so minute and so insignificant, but it was always within his, the purview of his sight line. And he looked at all the other evidence, and everything seemed to match up that, person X did it, or it happened in this particular way. And there's just that one little thing that just bugs him. And sure enough, that little item that seemed to contradict what everyone else thought happened was in fact the piece of evidence that concluded very clearly to us that this was the person who committed the crime. So I'm not saying you need to act like Columbo necessarily. You can probably look up clips on YouTube, but the idea is that when we are looking for evidence, you're not just randomly looking through things. You're looking through things in a way that are going to confirm a hypothesis that you already have. So if we randomly gather data on a topic in the hopes for a solution to turn up, you're first of all wasting your time, but you're also not thinking abductively. And what we mean by that is you have to formulate a good idea in your mind of what you think has happened. And that's the abductive part, right? You have a problem, you come up with a really good hunch. It is not the solution, but it is a possible solution. Start looking for evidence that will at least emphasize the possible, veracity, the truthfulness of that hypothesis. So when you're thinking abductively, you are starting with a plausible hypothesis, something that can be proven, and that evidence that you collect is going to be a way by which you can test whether that hypothesis is in fact correct. So the little diagram here, I know it was kind of small to look at, but here we see something that is kind of blown up and clear. Okay, so we are gathering data. We've got a hypothesis. We have what we expect to be the results that are going to be gleaned from that information versus the actual results that we get from the data. So as you can see along the top, we have a hypothesis. We expect that hypothesis to be proven by the evidence versus how many of those pieces of evidence actually confirm the idea. So there is that. Now, working towards the interpreting of the data, a whole range of things are going to be going on. As you're looking around, and of course that wisdom and experience is going to really help as you're looking through this. And of course, you're hoping the smoke is clear and you can actually see your way through there. But you're going to find things that will either support or oppose your hypothesis. You may find things that will inspire a revised assumption or, in fact, an entirely new hypothesis. So all of that data is either going to support, contradict, or surprise you, or at the very least, make it inconclusive. Then you've got to start all over again. So no matter what that piece of evidence is, right, that data is going to either support or oppose your hypothesis, right, your hunch, or it's going to revise the assumption that you initially had, right, your expectation, or at the very, well, not necessarily at the worst, but what it could lead to is a brand new hypothesis. There is always that possibility. Okay, the third one is to also guard against biases that are common in abductive thinking. This idea that we want things to be true. We hit on this sort of initial hypothesis and we're absolutely, correct. I've seen this before, right? I've seen this. I know what's going on. Well, there you are with that preconception, right? That you want something to be true simply because you think you've seen it before. When in fact, you should approach each, fire site as something uniquely different. Now, wisdom and experience is going to allow you to sort of look very carefully for clues, but you want to make sure that you don't hunker down with that one hypothesis and I'll be damned if it's anything else. And you only look for that one thing because that one true principle can lead you astray. So we need to be careful with that and make sure that we're not going to be stuck looking at the wrong thing. So if you are going to be doing this kind of work, you're doing what's called the scientific method. So if you start up here, for example, right, you start with gathering information, you form a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you analyze the data, you interpret the data. If you are doing something else, you could publish the results. You can retest if you need to. And of course, you need to also test and retest all the time. That's something you keep doing. And as you can see, you define the questions, you analyze the data, and you can see how all of these sort of interact, especially the fact that they're color-coded. But when you are gathering that information, you're looking for clues. And quickly you formulate a kind of hypothesis. And then now you're looking at what you've collected. You can discard some things, don't throw them completely away, but just set them aside. And then keep trying to formulate the hypothesis based on what you're seeing. But you don't go in blind, right? You go in with some degree of knowledge of what you think may be happening. So no matter what, when you are investigating a fire, you should always try to start with a plausible working hypothesis. No, aliens did not land here. There were not lasers from, outer space, whatever the wacky stuff that Marjorie Taylor Greene was talking about that started the California fires. That's insane, right? That's beyond a conspiracy theory. It's laughable. What we want is something that's not laughable, but something that's workable. So a plausible working hypothesis is something that we want to sort of walk in with. Because here, as you can see, when we start from that singular proposition, what is the fact? We have a fire. What is your working hypothesis? I believe it was caused by an explosion. It could have been a gas line. Okay, so we're working through. Okay, we have enough evidence to say that it was a hypothesis that has been proven. Now you start working through. Now, when you are doing the kind of work you're doing, you may go as far as here. When we go to law and theory, we're talking about sort of philosophy. But certainly a vast majority of this diagram fits the work you're going to be doing. You start with a fact, you have a working hypothesis or an ad hoc, which is like a collection of things, an auxiliary, like maybe a secondary hypothesis that you still keep in the back of your mind. But eventually you go from a hypothesis to a model and you say, this is what happened. I can show you how this occurred. In the case of the fire or the explosion we had a couple of years ago here on Woodman Ave, it was very clear what happened. Car hit the side of a house or the front of a house, dislodged the gas line, and a spark from somewhere ignited the gas and the house blew up. So that was fairly clear cut. But the investigators still went through to double check to make sure, even though it was very plausible that this was in fact what happened because there were so many witnesses. But the fire chief still went through the house to double check. So when you have that working hypothesis, you want to make sure that you are leaving yourself open to other possibilities, ad hoc or auxiliary hypotheses, but you always work with one that is fairly straightforward. Okay, so when we're talking about a hypothesis, and I'm saying that, you're gathering data and formulating one, you're kind of doing this at the same time, and you may have what's called a quick hypothesis, and you are looking for evidence that supports it rather than contradicts it. Now, this is a little bit like what I was discussing in our ethics and society class when you're working on a paper and you take a position on something. I am for or against capital punishment. I'm for or against euthanasia or whatever. Whatever the position is that you take, you typically look for material that will support it. But sometimes it's kind of interesting to find something that contradicts it and look to see how they formulate their argument. Because if you look at how the argument is formulated, you can address it, because that is the ethical way to write a paper, because you have to present it the opposing side. But if you look at it carefully, you can then maybe find out a way to strengthen your position by looking at an opposing viewpoint and knocking it down, and then telling the reader why this position is not valid. Here's why. Here's what they got wrong. Here's what they left out. These kinds of things. So when you are working, as much as you are trying to support your hypothesis, you also have to be asking yourself, okay, have I collected any data that could disprove this hypothesis? Is there something that could prove me wrong? And if that's the case, if you think back to the other diagrams that we're looking at, the data will either prove something because you have an expectation, and it will then say deliberately and for sure that this is correct, or it may point to a different direction. So as much as you are supporting data to confirm your hypothesis, always ask yourself, is this piece of evidence going to contradict what I think has occurred? So this is what data should be doing. So look at your data carefully. Look to see that it supports, but if it contradicts what you think is correct, set it aside. Do not ignore it. Just set it aside and continue working. And so as you are doing this, you're trying to interpret that evidence to a rather objective degree. So you can ask yourself, can I find more reliable evidence than I have right now? How can I interpret the evidence that I have that would go against rather than for my claim? Is the evidence that I've collected itself biased? So all these things are questions that you ask yourself because you have a critical mind and you are looking at this evidence saying, well, this particular little nugget I've got here proves my hypothesis. So you set it in the one pile. This one, plausible, maybe, put that in a different pile. And then something else, well, this clearly has got nothing to do with what I'm looking for. Set it aside. Don't ignore it, but set it aside. And then keep asking yourself, is what I have found working against or in favor of my hypothesis? And if you keep doing that, you will find information that is going to be able to help you very clearly. Now, when we are doing this kind of work, regardless of the experience and wisdom that you collect over the time that you will be doing this, you don't want to get too overconfident. You don't want to turn around and say, look, absolutely, I know what's going on. I mean, I can phone this one in. I don't have to show up. Here's what happened. You don't want to do that. You don't want to become too overconfident because you will end up falling under that sway of the one true principle. You're not looking objectively. You're not being reasonable and rational about the things that you've found. So at the first hint of contrary evidence, right, we might start to disbelieve that we're even able to come up with a hypothesis. That's not necessarily the case. It simply means that this is something that will cause you to question the accuracy of your theory, right, of your hypothesis. And that's kind of what's going on. So don't be too sure of yourself all the time. So if we are really overconfident, we're back to the same problem of that one true principle, right? It's this and nothing else, and I'll be damned if I look at any other pieces of evidence. Don't do that. Keep an open mind, because if you are overconfident, you're so entrenched in your belief that you're not even willing to try to change and think of something else. So you have to be really careful when you do that. We need to be a little bit more humble, right? We need to be a little bit more conciliatory to the evidence that we find. And of course, evidence too includes witnesses. People may have seen something, they may have heard an explosion. They may have been able to describe where it started first or where they saw the flames, coming up, came out of the kitchen or the basement or something. All that matters. So keep an open mind, listen carefully to what people have to say, and the likelihood of getting a good hypothesis is that much better. Now, I mentioned a moment ago the possibility of insufficient evidence. Evidence that does not confirm the hypothesis. So we need to be careful that we don't discount it completely. Now, there could be things that clearly are not going to work, because if you continue to find evidence that supports rather than questions or contradicts your hypothesis, likely you're on the right track. So those that work this way and keep an open mind and continually ask themselves questions, those critical thinkers, right, they judge their reasoning as sound only when they think they've found enough evidence that they consider to be an adequate amount to say that, yes, this hypothesis is in fact correct. Now the question becomes, what is enough, right? What is enough data or evidence to say that we are correct? So what you want to consider is the ability to acknowledge that there may be some evidence for a different belief. There may be things that we're not sure about, but you can still catalog and categorize that evidence as, for or against, inconclusive, and you simply go through that. And so when you say, do I have enough evidence? Well, you can always go back and keep looking. But you'll know over time with your wisdom and your experience if you have collected enough. Now remember, don't jump to conclusions. Don't fall under the sway of that one true principle. Instead, keep that open mind. And you will know if, let's say, 90% of the evidence you collect, the data you collect, proves your hypothesis, chances are you probably have enough, quote unquote, but you want to make sure that you have enough and you consider it objectively that you can then turn around and say that, yes, I believe I can say with a certain degree of clarity, the following happened. So if we're going to guard against leaping to these conclusions, which is something we have a tendency to do, especially if things look really familiar and we think we've seen this before, we typically go, yeah, I think it's that. So there's kind of 6 things we want to consider. First of all, consider all the solutions that we can think of. What are all the different possibilities that could have caused this fire? Imagine the data that might refute a given hypothesis. Then look for that. So let's say you argue, well, as much as I almost, in my gut believe it was a gas explosion, let's look for something else. Let's look for faulty wiring. Let's look for, someone was smoking in bed. They fell asleep and the bed caught on fire. As much as you may think that it is X, consider Y, right? Consider something else. So that's the second one. The third, if we can't refute our evidence, the data we've collected, watch for possibilities as we continue the research. So if we continue to find data that confirms our hypothesis, then yes, carry on because you're likely in the right track. But if we can find some piece of information, some data that refutes or contradicts our hypothesis, we need to still set that one aside. We don't ignore it, we set it aside. 4, gather the data objectively and then interpret the data objectively. And as you keep doing that, you gather more evidence because over time you may sort of overdo and overcompensate and collect too much. But if you're first starting out, you want to be able to weigh all the facts, and the facts are the data or the clues that you have. So it is possible to not leap to conclusions in the following way, the way that I've described right there. So if we follow those critical steps, then we can begin with a solution, claim, hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, that we then fully intend to support. So may not change our minds, but at least we can anticipate a reader's objections or another inspector's objections. We need to be able to consider the possibility of someone else saying that we're wrong, and it does happen. But if you follow the steps that we just pointed out, those 6 steps, looking at things objectively, gathering enough information, asking yourself the opposite, what if it was something else? Could I find data to refute that or confirm it? All those things make you a critical thinker. So now here we're talking about anticipating the biases of your reader. We're talking now about a paper, and this is where I collected this information. It's still the same process, because the reader in this case will be someone that could be reading, like they could work for an insurance company or the fire station or city hall, and you are now submitting that report. So the reader, in this case, it's still someone important, but they may also have their own biases. So we have to think about, how we can present evidence that contradicts their beliefs. What if those people also have fallen under the sway of the one true principle? They've got their own hunches, and even though they're not experts, they think this is what's happened. How do you change their mind, right? That's an important one. What kinds of overgeneralizations are they making? What kind of grand statements are they making about something that they have literally no evidence to prove as conclusive, as correct? So now you've got to turn around and dislodge some of these ideas that they have in their minds, the readers that is, and present something in an objective manner that they can now turn around and say, yeah, I was wrong. I think I jumped the gun on this one. So people do that. So some people it will be really, it's going to take a long time for them to shake those beliefs that they have, whatever may be, political or otherwise. They will have those beliefs that are just ingrained. They're simply part of who they are. So we still have got to try to show that those beliefs that they have are faulty. And it's not easy. It's an uphill battle. But we have to acknowledge that their beliefs, do exist. Now, what they're based on clearly is probably not not facts, that we can prove. As some people say, I don't know if it's a fact, I just know it's true. Well, what does that even mean? So we need to make sure that we can prove to them that what they believe is incorrect, because it isn't factual. It isn't based on verifiable evidence. It's just simply an opinion, right? It's not a fact. It's an intuition or a hunch, but at the worst, it is simply an opinion. So we need to make sure that we, at the very least, say, okay, maybe your belief is partially correct, but here's really what's going on, and I'm going to prove it to you by showing you the evidence that I have. So that's essentially the lesson in inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning. Inductive, specific to general, which is swans are white, all the swans I've seen are white, therefore all swans are white. Deductive, a general principle, someone's been murdered, and the so-and-so, the butler did it, that's your specific claim. But the most common kind of reasoning that you may recognize, because it's something we all do, is actually called abductive. And abductive starts with a hypothesis that you will consider as you are looking at the evidence, looking at data. So you come up and you formulate a hypothesis in your mind and go, okay, this is what I'm going to look for, but be always ready to change your mind, right? Don't fall under the sway of that one idea. Keep an open mind. So if we test that hypothesis using whatever reasoning seems appropriate, then we're going to be able to do a good job, because this kind of reasoning is problem driven. In this case is the fire. We need to find out what happened. And a kind of reasoning that begins with a hypothesis, I think this is what happened. And that is only a tentative solution to the problem. We need to then find out what we can find in, at the site that will allow us to say, yes, this is what has happened. So again, the three kinds of reasoning. If we think inductively, we might base a conclusion on too few instances. That happens quite often. If we think deductively, we think in a kind of formulaic sort of way, sort of a rote sort of situation each time. I haven't seen every swan in the world. Maybe there are some black swans, different colored swans, but this is what I know from my observation. But finally, when we think abductively, as useful as it is, it does have built into it these issues that once we come up with a hypothesis, there are cognitive biases that we have in ourselves that might force us to jump to the wrong conclusion, essentially. So we need to imagine more than one hypothesis. We need to deliberately look for evidence that might not fit into that initial hunch. The what ifs. The what ifs are always good. Think of a kind of a plan B. All right, what if this other thing happened? So when you are writing a report or you are in the field investigating a fire, you want to make sure that you guard yourself against this kind of biased form of thinking. So collect all your evidence, review your checklist as you develop your ideas, consider all the solutions that you can think of, imagine data that might disconfirm or deny or contradict your hypothesis. Watch for it as you do your own research to either confirm or deny the hypothesis. Gather and interpret your data objectively. Look at it from every point of view, and then gather more evidence than you need. So you will prove, let's say you have 50 pieces of evidence, and 35 of them all prove the one idea that you have. Well, the other ones likely will help, but you're definitely on the right track. But also always try to gather more evidence than you need. And eventually, it won't be as much work as you go into the field and investigate a fire. You're going to start seeing things that kind of pop out at you, but don't jump to conclusions. Always keep that open mind. And as soon as you see something, go, well, that's a sign of a gas explosion. But what if could something else have occurred? And you look at that piece of evidence, as much as it says, yes, this was a gas explosion, turn around and look for other things that could contradict it. Okay, so there we are, and the whole lesson is about 40 minutes. We're going to meet on Thursday at noon. There'll be a couple more, Again, fun assignments. Hopefully the ones from this week were okay. We're going to look at the various rhetorical devices that we looked at last week. So we'll do another short assignment that way. But I'll talk about it a little bit more when we meet on Thursday. And I'll go into a bit more detail and show you the specific instructions for those assignments. So in the meantime, take care. It's family day. It's about 3:15. I'll attend to 4. So enjoy the rest of the day, and we shall see you on Thursday.